But good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Fatima Abul Asrar. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Washington Center for Yemeni Studies. I'll be moderating the session today. Um, Very briefly, WCYS is an independent research center focused on Yemen, the Arabian Peninsula. We're funded primarily through individual donors. And a quick logistical note before we begin, simultaneous translations are available for today's webinar through the interpretation function on Zoom. Today's discussion, the future of Yemen South under Saudi oversight, comes at a moment of real transition. Over the past several weeks, we've seen changes in Yemen structure. The southern political landscape, in particular, has changed fundamentally. The Southern Transitional Council has dissolved, its leadership removed from the scene, and Saudi Arabia has assumed direct control of the southern political file. A supreme military committee also now operates under Saudi command. Military formations have been restructured, and decision-making that once appeared shared between all partners has now shifted decisively to Riyadh. The internationally recognized government remains in place, but the locus of authority has moved. So this is hands-on management at the moment from Saudi Arabia. Uh, so today we're asking what this new reality means in practice. What does Saudi oversight mean for the southern political aspirations, governance arrangements, and security dynamics? How should we understand the current state of presidential leadership, council, and the broader anti-Houthi coalition under the new configuration, and what are the implications? Um, Before I introduce the speakers, I wanted to note that Vice Minister Mustafa Nu'man, who was originally scheduled to join us, was unable to attend due to ongoing political developments and the anticipated formation of a new government in Yemen. So his absence itself is a reflection of how fluid the situation is at the moment. Um, I am very pleased to be joined today by three panelists who bring complementary perspective to the discussion. Dr. April Ali is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and a former senior political advisor to the UN Special Envoy to Yemen. Dr. Saad Din Talib is a member of the Presidium of the Hadramaut National Council and a former Yemeni minister and parliamentarian. He has deep experience in local governance dynamic. And last but not least is Ambassador Marwan Ali Nauman. He's a senior research fellow at WCYS and a veteran Yemeni diplomat with extensive experience in political processes, diplomacy, and Yemen's economic challenges. So thank you all for being here on such a very short notice. Um, very briefly on the flow, each panelist will give us 7 to 10 minutes for initial remarks, and then we'll begin with broader political and just security picture. We'll move to Hadramaut and then followed by economic implications for Yemen. And I'll close with a short question for each speaker. With that, let's begin. April, I'd like to start with you from Washington and UN perspectives. How does Saudi Arabia direct assumption of the Southern File? How is it being interpreted? What does this shift that we saw mean for mediation, for international engagement? Is it something that you think is going to bring stability?
Sure. First, thank you, Fatima, and thank you for the Washington Center for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here and also be on a panel with these distinguished guests and friends. So I've been asked to speak about this perspective from Washington, and also make a few comments about the UN, what this might mean for the UN negotiations. So let me start with Washington. And I'll start by stating the obvious. Yemen is not a priority in Washington, D.C. It's not a priority for the Trump administration. There was a sharp uptick in attention to Yemen last year during Operation Rough Rider for about 52 days. And that military campaign kind of ended as quickly as it began with a bilateral truce agreement between the U.S. and the Houthis. So it's very much an America First policy. And I think since then and until now, despite all these dramatic events in the South and what we're seeing as Yemen watchers, I don't see a real shift in kind of what's guiding U.S. approach to Yemen. Again, since Operation Rough Rider, there have been two basic pillars. The first is to maintain this truce with the Houthis in the Red Sea, and that has been assisted by the ceasefire in Gaza. And the second, which kind of pulls in a different direction, is the U.S. continues to put pressure on the Houthis through sanctions and through weapons interdictions. And this is part of the campaign against Iran in the region. Just last week, we've seen the U.S. Treasury continues to do its work, and they have sanctioned a new list of individuals and entities who are providing dual-use materials to the Houthis and also fuel. So again, despite this kind of dramatic events that Yemen watchers may follow, I do not see a reshuffling in a significant way in U.S. posture. I would say that, just taking a step back and looking at it from the 30,000-foot perspective from the U.S., the U.S. right now is making a strategic shift under this administration to focus on the Western Hemisphere. So we're seeing this with Venezuela, with more attention on Cuba, Mexico. I mean, a larger basket of issues. But I would argue, and we're also seeing this written in the new national security strategy that was released, but I would argue that effectively on the ground, there's a contradiction between what is being said by this administration and what is being done in the Middle East. So if you look at U.S. Military posture, where troops are located, where assets are allocated, if you look at where the envoys from State Department are spending their time, I would argue that effectively there's not been a pivot away from the Middle East. But that posture is very much focused on the protection of Israel, the defense of Israel, on pushback against Iran, and on building relations with the Gulf, right? We've seen expanded security agreements, for example, like the executive agreement with Qatar. Yemen is peripheral to this. So I think we need to understand that Yemen is peripheral to these bigger issues. When the Saudis and the Emiratis started coming to blows inside of Yemen, that did garner attention in Washington. So you had, Marco Rubio making phone calls, making comments. You had senior advisor Boulos in the region, meeting with President Ali, meeting with others. There was this statement of U.S. policy saying the U.S., Saudi, Emiratis are on the same page with fighting the Houthis and extremist organizations. But still, I would argue this is pretty light touch. There's no U.S. leadership still in the Yemen file. There's no envoy. I do not expect an envoy. And there's really not even leadership or like active mediation between core Gulf allies, where the U.S. is, has a lot of economic investment in the Gulf right now in particular. There's no concerted mediation to get those two allies on the same page to address the root causes, not just in Yemen, but in other venues in the region. What could change this? What could change U.S. attention to Yemen in a meaningful way? If the Houthis start shooting at the U.S. or attacking U.S. assets in the region, that would obviously change the picture. I have a question in my mind if tensions between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which seem to be heating up and other venues not cooling down, at what point would the U.S., the escalation between those allies affecting U.S. equities in other areas, would the U.S. take a more active role? But again, this is not about Yemen. So that ends kind of my commentary on the situation in Washington, but I'll go to the UN now. So the UN mediation space, as we know, has been fraught, right, for some time. So ever since there was this push in 2023 for the roadmap agreement, very shortly after that, right? The events in Gaza and the Red Sea, I think, froze and then upended that national level framework. I don't see a chance of going back to the roadmap agreement as it was originally constructed based on the US position, also based on just where the combatant parties are inside of Yemen at this time. Given what's happened in the South, Fatima, what you opened with, right? Like the Emiratis pulling out, Saudi Arabia really stepping in a very strong way, all of these changes happening in government. In the military sector. I mean, for me, there are just too many question marks right now to really know where a potential mediation process goes. I mean, I think in the immediate term, there's very little prospect for reviving kind of a national level, mediation until some of these core issues are resolved. Is Saudi Arabia going to be able to kind of corral these various factions within the government of Yemen side to a more cohesive negotiating position, political position, military position? I mean, certainly, if that happens, that would overcome a lot of the challenges that the UN mediation was facing. And we always faced a challenge with there not being like the Houthis are very cohesive. They have a position. They have, they have a negotiating stance where the government of Yemen was always highly fractured. So, of course, theoretically, if there is a coming together on that side, it overcomes some of that fragmentation. There's also the issue of the South-South dialogue, right? So we have the South-South dialogue. Maybe Dr. Saad could talk a little bit more about this. I'm not really sure what exactly the goal of the dialogue is and how it's going to fit in with a national level mediation process. So if you get the Southerners to come together to come to some terms facilitated by the Saudis on some principles, is that then going to be taken to a national, mediation structure facilitated by the UN? How do others within the government of Yemen side react? I mean, how will the Houthis react? So there's a lot of questions in my mind of how would the connective tissue, right, between these processes. But I would say that even if you have some coherence, if we come out of this with a more coherent government position, some principles in the South, right? Even in that scenario, I would say that the positions of the Yemeni combatants are extremely far apart right now. And so, I'm not sure, of course, the STC, when it was part of these negotiations, didn't want Southern resources to ever be used, right? And in terms of if the Houthis wanted to share oil, these kinds of things. But other components of the government of Yemen also were opposed to elements of the roadmap. And I don't think we've seen any indication that Ansar Allah has reduced its requirements. So I think the Yemeni sides are still going to be fairly far apart. So you could see a coming together on the government side actually leading to even a new round of conflict, right? So if they're more cohesive and close together, they might seek to rebalance the playing field militarily before you would come back to a national level process. Two more quick points, and then I'll end. I think I'm almost done with my 5. Is that, I think that the Houthis, Ansar Allah, when they look at what's happening, I mean, first, I think it's striking that they haven't acted in any way, kind of the silence on the military front. So, I mean, they also get a vote in everything that's happening, and we'll, need to watch that closely. But I think they'll interpret what's happened on the government of Yemen side as reaffirming their position that, these government of Yemen group does not have efficacy. They're not the decision makers. Saudi is the decision makers. External actors are the decision makers. And so we're going to negotiate with Saudi. So I think that'll reaffirm that position, which makes it very difficult for UN mediators who are mandated a Yemeni negotiation. But ultimately, I think the UN still plays an important role, I think, as a placeholder for hopefully what will be, an eventual Yemeni mediation process. The Saudis are really stepping in right now, and they've been involved in the mediation space. I mean, quite actively, even in the roadmap time, and now even more so. But ultimately, Saudi Arabia wants out of Yemen, right? They want out of Yemen in a way that's good for Saudi Arabia, not a continuation of the war necessarily. They ultimately want to, at some point, focus on their domestic economy, focus on Vision 2030. And so, while you do see that Yemen is so critical and integral to their national security, and they stepped in a big way in Hadramaut, and they're coming in here for this, discussion with the Yemeni government. there is a Yemeni process that will take, some time, especially if we really start those active negotiation processes. And I don't think I've heard until this point, any Gulf state, including Saudi Arabia, wanting to carry that very long process all the way through. So you still have the UN kind of having that umbrella role if and when the situation is right for that to start. So that is my intervention, Fatima.
Oh, thank you so much, April. I have so many questions. And you can definitely, like on the last point that you mentioned in terms of the Houthis, you could initially see different messaging coming out, but it's sort of the main message or the main theme is that we were always right. This coalition was going to fracture because they've predicted it. Uh, and they don't want to see Saudi Arabia consolidate Yemen factions because that stands to weaken them. Same time, I also saw some messaging in which they were attempting to say maybe Saudi Arabia should, and this is before the SDC dissolution. They were trying to appeal to Saudi Arabia to make a deal with them rather than lose its friends or lose any potential in both North and South. So uh, Houthis are opportunist in that regard, but also it's the very important point, especially the idea about the roadmap, that it wasn't just paused but overtaken by the events, and that the mediation challenge has always been, negotiating fragmentation on one side against cohesion on the other. But with that, Dr. Saadeddin, I want to pick up exactly there and bring this down to the local level. Much of what April described hinges on whether Saudi Arabia can actually impose coherence on the government side, particularly in the south, from where you sit in Hadramaut. How are these changes being experienced on the ground? What has the rapid restructuring of political and military authority meant for local governance, public sentiment, perhaps, and the political mobilization? What do you see the emerging consensus? Is it doesn't seem like there is much resistance to what Riyadh is envisioning in the south of Yemen, but do you think that on the ground they're going to contend with all of these changes that are going to go, going ahead?
Thank you, Fatma. Thank you. Good to see you, April, Ambassador Marwan, and our friend Abdul. Thank you for having me. And this is a good opportunity to actually speak from a totally different perspective because my good friend April, she spoke, of course, of the eternal or the all-time lens, which is focusing on Yemen over the last 12, 13 years, on simply on solving the problems that are impacting the rest of the world. But nobody is really thinking about, or I'm not saying nobody, of course, the people of Yemen are impacted heavily by this crisis. And it is about time, actually, to start thinking about the impact on the people of Yemen and the future of Yemen, and not simply the impact of the problems of Yemen on the rest of the world. I understand. I'm sad actually that even the UN is mostly looking at that lens on how can Yemen not be a problem to the rest of the world, although it is actually a failed state and it's a failing economy and there is poverty and there is people are going hungry and they're fighting and they have guns and they have all sorts of problems. Now, so how do we get out of this? How do we get out of this? And there are people involved with us, like Saudi Arabia and different other countries. And the people are not really now. Everybody understands that the focus of, for instance, the Europe or the United States or even the United Nations is not really on actually trying to solve. For instance, I'll give you an example. What kind of Yemen do we want in the future? Do we want Houthi-controlled Yemen? even if they do it by armed forces, by armed force, and actually subjugating the people of Yemen. So in that context, or in that picturing, I'd like to look at the current events, or the current and the involvement of Saudi Arabia. I think Saudi Arabia now has realized that Yemen needs to have peace, and they need to have a lasting peace, and not simply to roll over the problems of Yemen for another 2 or 3 decades. How does that picture come in? Of course, there was a mistake to bring in a leadership of 8 presidents, or 8 members of a presidential council. That was not a good move, I think, and everybody has commented on that. And because of the different agendas that are in this presidential council. Now, the eternal problem of Yemen has been actually tyranny, basically, since for 6 decades. Tyranny in the south, tyranny in the north, tyranny after unification, tyranny after unification, tyranny after the war. And that's exactly what has happened in the last couple of months, when there is what I see as a tyrannical force or a dictatorship of the STC, for instance, never mind the Houthis. We are already established that what kind of political rule and what kind of economic rule and what kind of even ideological rule that they want to impose on Yemen. But if we take the STC, with support, of course, foreign support, they have expanded their reach, they have expanded their military force, and their mindset of dictatorship, basically, on wanting to rule Yemen by a specific zone in South Yemen. But they wanted to, of course, regain the south of Yemen under a specific ideology or a specific power center that wanted to impose this on the rest of Yemen. This is not a healthy progress. When the STC has actually invaded, and I say invaded, Hadramaut, it of course rang a huge bell in the minds of the Saudis, and they say, "Oh, this is national security for us." There is a huge interest of the Saudis in Hadramaut, and they cannot be overtaken by a force that is uncertain how it plays and how it would impact its security, and because of the border. Now that under a long time, I'm talking about a month plus, a month or 2 days, these forces have been nicely asked to leave and to restart, to regain the original position that was there, hopefully, for this negotiations to go on. And of course, they wouldn't listen. And of course, the many attempts that were, including the warning shots that were fired, and that didn't work. So eventually, we all know what happened. There was a total collapse of the STC by its military and its leadership. And now the Saudis are now, what do we do about the South? So they said, okay, let's have a dialogue. The dialogue, of course, is a long process, and it's also a complicated process that needs a lot of preparation. So the first thing, of course, now what is happening in Riyadh is basically they've called in a lot of people, and they said, okay, so let's start and see what are your thoughts. And the thoughts, of course, they express that they want to regain South Yemen. There is a different perspective in places like Hadramaut, Shabwa, and Mahra. They do not see themselves under such a tyrannical rule of the STC or something like it, for instance, like the Houthis. They don't see that. We're actually looking at the future and we as Hadramis, we are trying to rebuild a nation. We know that this country that we are in, not by our own choice, but by actual force, we were joined into South Yemen first, and then into united Yemen by actual military force and by political force and whatever force there is. And we are forced to be in that, and which this nation, because of its structure, because of its of how it was structured, basically state capture by corruption, which was inevitably going to fail, and it failed. So this failure now is what we are trying to deal with. How do we regain a country? How do we rebuild a country? We have to rethink everything. And I think the Saudis have come to realize that. We cannot just bring the same old mentalities, the same old mindsets, or the same old power centers to recapture the country again and then have another problem in 10 years or 15 or 20 years down the road. This is not, how are we going to regain peace and regain not only stability, but also some economic progress that will lead us somewhere. So this is the whole setting that is supposed to happen for the South-South dialogue that's happening in Riyadh. What is the future Yemen? What is the future South? What is the future Hadramaut? Of course, there was an attempt in the national dialogue that was done in Sana'a about 12 years ago. About 12 years ago. And there are outcomes of this dialogue. Now, these outcomes, they came up with some sort of a draft constitution that was restructuring the capture again. Because here the devil's in the details. It is recapturing the power and recapturing the resources again in that draft, which was, of course, nevertheless, the whole thing was recaptured again by the Houthis and the whole thing collapsed. So now what we have is a failed state, multiple armed militias, and multiple agendas. For us, all we want to do is present, for us, Hadramaut, what we want is to present with whoever wants to rejoin in rebuilding a future state, a modern state, depending on standing on accountability and combating corruption and sharing of power. Just give me if I have 1 minute left, just tell me you have 1 minute left and I'll wrap it up. But I can go on for hours and describing this huge problem that not only personally, but a whole population that has seen its life degraded over so many years. And now there is no promise, or there is hopefully now a new promise that this will change. But we have not seen anything from, I'm tackling the real issues of humanity, which is justice and allowing a people to rebuild its nation, and not giving some militia that has its own ideologies and has its own very, very medieval ideas to run the country again, and then to just run us into another problem or run the whole region into a problem. So essentially, what we are presenting is a new thing. If that does not work, a new thing meaning a decentralized state, a decentralized country, basically formed of several, I don't know how many, but the National Dialogue says 6 regions or 6 states in a union that allows every one of these components of the state to run its life and to rebuild the country, rebuild the economy, rebuild the society into a better future. And I think it is a chance for Hadramaut to do that now. And we have presented many, many documents and many ideas. And I hope that this forum that is being suggested in Riyadh will give us an opportunity to present this case. And this case is against all the ills that Yemen has suffered from. These ills are lifelong ills that we need to address. Maybe I'll stop here, and I want to come back with further details. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saadetdeen. I know this is a conversation that could go on for hours, and we could listen to you for hours. But really, what you've described isn't just a political and security challenge. It's just really lived experiences for people in the south and Hadramaut, a population that just like watched these institutions collapse, right? And you've underscored also something really important, to which is kind of like, whatever comes next cannot necessarily be just about control or containment. There are real issues that need to be discussed and addressed. And you're also kind of like making an important distinction that dismantling one actor, it was also kind of like about preventing the emergence of another centralized coercive authority in the South. So, and one that Riyadh really viewed as unpredictable, right? Like structurally risky it was for Saudi, especially given its borders, geography, political orientation was also very different, with the SDC open on the Abraham Accords, which is something that stressed Saudi Arabia, I would imagine. So, so many questions, so I'll come back to you with more questions on that. But I wanted now to turn to Ambassador Marwan, because everything now we heard is just about, consolidation, control, rebuilding. Saudi Arabia is taking the Yemen file. UAE is sort of pushed aside, and UAE was a lifeline for many in the south. There is a governance infrastructure in the south that the UAE kind of, nurtured, and economic lifelines are going to be maybe, somewhat cut because of that. I wanted to get from you a perspective in terms of how do Yemen's economic constraints, institutional breakdown, shape what's actually possible in the South right now and in Yemen in general, right? And to what extent is um, economic management is something that is currently being considered in Riyadh, which is very clearly focused on the military side.
Thank you very much, Fatima, and glad to be among these August panelists. As widely mentioned, actually, you rightly mentioned that the changes on the ground, the dramatic developments in the south has taken actually everyone, and the economic situation in Yemen has been overlooked, let alone, of course, the humanitarian situation. But I will try briefly in my intervention to focus on and shed some lights actually on the current situation and the challenges that are facing the government, and also introduce some recommendations. These challenges is of two natures actually. One, some of these points are of stabilization nature. The others of institutional repair, I would say. Now, I divided these points into three categories. Some challenges need to be addressed in the short term, and some on the medium term, and the others on the long term. In the short run, first and the most important thing is paying the delayed salaries of civil servants. We know that for the last couple of years, the government has faced difficulties in paying salaries due to huge deficits in national revenues, and depended actually heavily on the Saudi projecting money into paying these salaries. So now I think the first thing is that the government needs to pay the overdue salaries, and you know that, for example, the diplomatic section, for example, has been without salaries now for more than 1 year. But actually, the problem is also that the government needs to think about paying the salary now on a basis regular. Saudi Arabia has pledged $90 million to pay these salaries. But I say then afterwards, the most important thing is that the government consider how to pay the salaries on a regular basis. The second thing is providing services, services like electricity, water, and health services is really of huge importance. We know that electricity malfunction actually was one of the most contentious issues for years that consumed hundreds of millions of dollars due to mismanagement, corruption, but also the tension between the government factions. So I think we have also, once again, Saudi Arabia announced a pledge of $500 million, a package of some projects in the southern governorates. And part of this $500 million will go to buy oil derivatives in order to keep the power station running. We know also that United Arab Emirates announced $1 billion, for example, last November, but I don't think that this is the case anymore. And I think that Saudi Arabia, for example, needs to step in to fill the gap in this sector. One of the points as well is that I think the government needs to consolidate revenues from customs, from taxations, and from other resources in order to enhance the national revenues. Unfortunately, I think we have, most of us, if not all of us, heard some recent media reports about the cuts, the billions of Yemeni riyals cuts from the government budget, but also illegal extorted customs that used to go to the STC. And I think one of the issues that the government needs to stop all these illegal cuts. The other point, I think, Socotra Island. Socotra Island and its population depends heavily on tourism. We know that since the UAE has controlled the island in 2018, it launched a direct flight from Abu Dhabi into the island, bringing thousands of tourists to the island, and actually that helped the island inhabitants to generate income, but also have some sort of economic stability. And I think since that flight stopped, the government needs now to start a new direct flights either from Saudi airports or from Cairo airport, for example, to resume the tourism activities in the island. The other point, I think also that the government needs to introduce a transparent and implementable annual budget for the year 2026. Since 2015, there was no actual budget has been produced or introduced by the government, except in 1 year in 2018, the government introduced a budget of $3.9 billion expenditure and $2.5 billion revenues. But of course, I mean, the government has operated, other than that, in the other years, the government has operated through ad hoc financial measures, depending heavily actually on the foreign aid, mainly from Saudi Arabia, to gap the budget deficits. Now, on the medium term, I think that there are two steps that the government needs to take. The first one is the necessity to fight the corruption and the corruption networks that has been rampant actually within the state institutions. And one of the measures that can be taken is either reactivate the anti-corruption bodies, or at least reform these bodies. The other thing is that the Yemeni Central Bank, the Yemen Central Bank needs to continue its monetary policies that stabilize the Yemeni real value if not, of course, enhance it. Now, on the long run, we all know that the Saudi financial support to pay the salaries, but also to keep the power stations running, is a temporary solution and it's not sustainable. So I think the government needs to consider some sustainable measures and policies, including encouraging strategic investments in various sectors, including energy, electricity, and infrastructure. And the second point, actually, that in order for these, to encourage national and international investments in Yemen, I think a reliable and strong judicial system need to be put in place in order to encourage business people to increase investments and have confidence. We know that billions of dollars could have been invested in Aden, unfortunately, but because of the unstable situation and the hostile policies that has been created by the STC in Aden, these capitals has moved into neighboring countries and other countries in the region. The last point, I think, is resuming the exporting oil from the government areas. We know that since October 2026, exporting oil has stopped because of the Houthi attacks on the exporting terminals in Hadramaut and Shabwa. And I think the government has three options to do so. The first option is to that the authorities start the maintenance process of the exporting terminals and start exporting the oils. But this option, I think, is unrealistic because of two things, or 2 points. The first one is that the possibility of the Houthis that they attack again these terminals, but also that the government will face difficulty in finding buyers who would like, or are ready to take the risk. That led us to the second option, that the government strike a deal with the Houthis, maybe brokered by the Saudis, to resume exporting the oil, but also and then share the revenues with the Houthis. And I think this option is a medium-term one, but also is visible to some extent. The third option is also to strike a deal with the Houthis to export the oil brokered by the Saudis and the UN. But this deal could be within a comprehensive peace agreement, includes political, economic, and military solution. But I think this option will take some time to be achieved. I will stop here and then I'm ready to take questions. Thank you, Fatma.
Thank you, Ambassador Marwan. I'm sure you're aware, a few days ago, 2 or 3 days ago, there was the Treasury announcement, sanctions on the Houthis. And one particular part that stood out is that the Houthis were generating $2 billion annually from illicit networks, in pretty much from oil exports and activity. And I was wondering if, Yemenis would actually be okay in any kind of arrangement to facilitate the oil going out. I mean, out of Hadramaut, paying, what is it, like a fine for the Houthis in order to let them go. How do you convince Yemeni people that this is an arrangement that can be accepted, as opposed to pressuring the Houthis to accept this, the status quo? The other thing is, we haven't seen attacks by the Houthis recently. I mean, especially since Israel intensified and wiped out half of their cabinet, degraded their capabilities. And we've seen really the Houthis activity just take down much more of an aggressive domestic posture and mobilization, increase threats, but we haven't really seen them translate anything yet. Do you think, the government could perhaps try again to test the waters and see if it can stand up to the Houthis? Because the entire arrangement is completely different at this time.
Yes, actually, I mean, that was one of the options, and that's, excuse me, and that's why I put it the first option, that the government maybe, especially after what happened now, that try to test the water and try to, export the oil and see what the reaction of the Houthis will be. But as I said, also there will be, I think, some difficulties to convince some buyers actually to take the risk. I think this is, this is the only concern maybe that the government will face, and we can see from that.
Great. Thank you so much, Ambassador Marwan. Maybe I'll move to April. You kind of described a moment in which national level mediation is effectively frozen. International engagement remains slightly light touch, but reactive. And based on what we've heard about, security consolidation, economic triage, do you see international actors adapting to this new reality? I mean, how do you see them adapting to it? And maybe even continue to operate with frameworks that no longer really match what's happening on the ground? And we see a gap. I see a gap, but what's the risk if that gap persists?
Yeah, first of all, I just really enjoyed listening to the ambassador and Dr. Saad. I think what really struck me was how, Dr. Saad is talking about these big picture issues, right? Like what we were talking about in the national dialogue, but all Yemenis like, what kind of Yemen do we want? Right? I mean, if we're going to have a decentralized system, how many regions is it going to be? All the details around, those kinds of big questions about the future of Yemen. And I will say that one of the things that's been frustrating to so many people working on the mediation process, right, since basically Kuwait, is that we haven't had a real substantive discussion on root causes. The roadmap is not that. That's not what the roadmap was, right? It was trying to get a ceasefire, some economic relief, so that you could then start to talk about, the bigger issues at hand. So when I hear Dr. Saad talk, I think, oh, this is an opportunity in the sense that there's a potential for Yemenis, at least in one cluster, and it is a problem that, right, you don't have the whole country being involved in this, but they have a chance to go back and start to talk about these really fundamental issues, right? That Dr. Saad is saying there's been a change in Saudi Arabia, which might allow that to happen, right? The desire to have like a lasting peace. I think that can potentially be a positive, but then listening to Ambassador Marwan, it's like, where's the electricity? Where's the payment? Where are the services? Kind of all of these issues. And so what struck me is the timeline issue here. All right. So, I mean, if you can't kind of get those things going on the ground, the opportunity to talk about the bigger strategic issues is going to be overtaken, by frustration, by, like basically the situation on the ground. And we saw that actually in the transition process. Remember, all of us there, right? So I think there's some lessons learned maybe from the Yemenis who are doing this right now, for the Saudis who've now really taken a leadership role in this process, right? For the need to have some separation between the government, right, and people who are providing security on the ground, and maybe those who are involved in, the negotiations over South-South dialogue or bigger picture issues, because both of them have to run in parallel. So that just struck me listening to both of these interventions. I think there's some big lessons learned here. It also struck me that again, this pivot in Riyadh, but I would also, just as a cautionary tale, again, as you were saying, Fatima, and others, it's like the gap that Riyadh is filling is huge, right? Because the UAE also was providing resources in that area. Now it's all Riyadh, the complications are even more than they were, 10, 15 years ago to overcome on the political level. So again, I think we have like a time horizon issue here too. While the Saudis, of course, want durable peace and stability in Yemen, how long are they going to be willing, able to step and fill in this gap, especially if we don't have some initial successes. And I think we're seeing some of them. But I think there is, kind of, it's really an opportunity for, again, the Yemeni actors to also start to think about, how to take some of this back, right, on themselves. And that leads to your question, Fatima. We're in a completely different international system right now. It's chaotic in terms of where things are going with the U.S. role globally. This is not about Yemen at all, or about it's much, much, much bigger than that. I mean, I'm middle powers, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, others are stepping in to areas of mediation, war, alliances, other things, in ways that I think are going to be much bigger moving forward, just because of shifts in the larger global system. So I think that, yeah, I don't see necessarily, for example, as going back to my original presentation, and what Saad said about caring about the Yemenis, I don't see shifts in Washington happening on those issues, right? Like I just don't see that. So where that might have been in the past, like a priority to come in on human rights, humanitarian stabilization, I don't see that. Europe has, many different priorities, particularly in Ukraine. I mean, so I see this in many ways. This is Yemeni, and it's more in the regional file. Not that the P5 and others won't have some role. So.
Thank you, April. I mean, two things also come, come to mind as you spoke about this. First is the real issues that you rightly mentioned, and Ambassador Marwan talked about, the electricity, bread and butter issues, and these are fundamental to the stability of the quote unquote liberated areas, because the majority of the rest and turmoil that happened during the national dialogue in 2013 happened because there was political dialogue in the capital that was completely disconnected from what Yemeni people felt. Fundamentally, Yemenis felt that it was a superficial process that did not really impact their lives because there was no economic benefits. In fact, people were complaining about the food in the Movenpick hotel while they were starving in their home. So it was just a stark reality. There was just a lot of contradictions, and there was no buy-in. Currently, I think Yemenis want to see an empowered entity that would stand up to the Houthis so that they can have, more of a, just more of an opportunity to stand up to the fragmentation that's happening is not helping. So they want to make sure that the Houthis stand weakened in contrast, and I think that's really important. Um, uh, but ultimately, I think, the United States is making a strategic mistake by not understanding how important Yemen is because of its location on the Red Sea, because of what Houthis were able to do in terrorizing, the entire world with global maritime shipping, becoming almost arrested like a year ago until we were able to find a deal with them. But military power did not work at that time. And the Houthis continue to use the Red Sea as leverage for political purposes whenever they're threatened. And currently, they're not feeling threatened. We can see their language is becoming heightened again, and they're open to using force again. And I think this happens because of the unrest that's happening in Iran. So geopolitically, globally, they're very important. They're a very important card for Iran and also for Russia and China. But maybe that's a conversation, another conversation that we can have, because a stable Yemen on a micro scale translates translate to a global stability as well on a global scale. Yes, Dr. April.
No, just to say that, I mean, the narrative in Washington certainly recognizes the threat from the Houthis to maritime security, right? And so I think that's why you see this attention to sanctions and to weapons interdiction. So that is there, but the question is, and I don't see the U.S. leadership, right, on the diplomatic front or the approach to addressing that beyond what we have right now, which is current quiet in the Red Sea. So I think there's a lot of deference to kind of how Gulf allies are approaching it.
Thank you. And Dr. Saad, probably you know, we can maybe talk again about, I mean, the economic issue I feel is really important. Ambassador Marwan again like talked about corruption. You know, you were in anti-corruption committees back in the day when you were in Yemen. Um, Transparency is a very important issue, and we don't see transparency around the economic file and even the political file. And I was wondering if you can speak to us about that.
Okay, thank you. This is where I want to do a bit of a reset. It's so easy to say corruption and so easy to say we will fight corruption. Or it's so easy to say there is power problem and we will fix the power problem. But what stops it from happening? Now, I've worked with governance for like 25 years. And I've studied the governance problem or the corruption problem of Yemen since 1999. And until now, I read a lot about what happens to countries like Yemen and the kind of corruption that happens in it. Can you fix the power problem without fixing corruption? You can't. Can you fix corruption without fixing the governance? You cannot. It's all about political will and fixing the decision-making process and making it a fair one and making it a transparent one and making it a good decision-making process. Without that, you're just gonna continue rolling over. Let me speak a bit as a doctor, as a physician. The first problem is stop the bleeding. Then think about the diabetes or think about the kidney problem or whatever other problems that you may have. Right now, the bleeding is from power struggle. People wanting to grab power, and with power comes resources and wealth. That is the essential, whether it's for the Houthis, whether it's for the STC and many other players. The central issue here remains, how do I get power? What kind of military force do I get? And how do I make money out of it? If we don't fix that, and to have a centralized good decision-making process to rebuild Yemen, and on what kind of rebuilding, I am sure if you rebuild Yemen on a centralized basis, that these ills will come in again. These problems will creep in again. The capture will come in again and the corruption will come in again. And we will face the same problem in 20, 25 years. The same problem, the same issues, even if we are able to do something about, how do we live for the next 20 years? Here, I come to another issue. Long spoken by most people on the streets, most journalists, most even politicians, about the resources that are in Hadramaut and the export of oil. How much oil is left in Yemen to be exported? The last figures, all of the oil that is, if allowed to be exported, it's between 70 to 80,000 barrels a day. Down from the peak, which was in 2001, which is 470,000 barrels a day. Now this 60, 70,000 barrels a day, under the current conditions, may have gone down to 40, 50,000 barrels a day, which is not enough to even buy the fuel for the power supply. So we need to look at everything differently. How do we restructure this country is what we want to present in this dialogue. We have the vision to do this. How do we do it? It's not by greed. It's not by appeasing greed. Whether it's Houthi, whether it's STC, whether it's any other power player. I remember having conversations with the UN envoy's office, let me say. I don't want to be personal. Said, look, what are you doing now? You are appeasing basically gangsterism or bullies. Oh, we cannot tolerate now new aspirations in Yemen. For instance, the aspirations of the Hadrami people. We call my fight for a better future an aspiration, a new aspiration that cannot be tolerated. I do not want to take anybody's power or anybody's resources. I do not want to kill anybody. I do not want to use arms to attack Shabwa or to attack Mahara. I want to rebuild the nation. And I want to tell Yemen, how can this country be rebuilt? Now, the question comes, how do we unify Yemen again? Why do we reunify Yemen again? Under what rules? Under what government? Under what kind of structure? The same thing, we roll over the same messy situation since the 60s. We've had this problem. Is that by these elites who capture the state, and then whether it's ideological, whether it's a corruption thing, the state is captured by elites who run the country down. This is the ideas. These are the new lines of thought that we want to instill. I understand the United States. I totally understand, April, that the United States will never put Yemen in its priority list, even if 5 million people die. I understand that. But the UN, that's its duty, isn't it? So what we need to do is have a new lens, a new eye on how to solve the problems of Yemen. No more bullies. And this bully thing, the United Nations said, no, this cannot be tolerated. I understand the rules and the borders that the United Nations speech is based on. Don't instigate anybody. Don't make anybody angry, even if he kills people. Even if he runs down the country, just don't make them angry. Because our job is to make everybody happy. Now what we want, if this is going to be under the guidance, let's say, what was the title? It says under the Saudi oversight. Okay, that's a nice word. Is to rethink this rebuilding the state. How do we rebuild it? We can't go back to the outcomes of the 2013 dialogue, but not under the mindset that has written the draft constitution. No. Let us decentralize this power that has only caused Yemen a lot of harm, a lot of distress, and a lot of robbery and theft. Corruption. How do we fight corruption? I can give you a whole thing. First thing you need is a political will to fight corruption. How was the political will available in the presidium of 8 people? Can you do that? So these are my initial thoughts of how this can go forward. And thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saad. I mean, I think it's a good place to end. I really want to thank you for this. I mean, it's clear there are no easy answers here, but hopefully conversations like this help clarify what's actually at stake. Thank you for bringing us to a very human level and end to this. I want to thank our panelists for their candor and insight, and thank you everyone who joined us today and contributed with thoughtful questions. We'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.